Welcome back to Recruiting Blitz. As always, I'm Tim Verghese. Appreciate you guys tuning in. Before we get started, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel. Spring ball's kicking off as we're speaking. Nebraska is kicking off spring ball starting this week, running through April 26th. We'll be boots on the ground in Lincoln for media availabilities, open practices over the next few weeks, and so much more. If you haven't already, be sure to check out the spring ball preview that Steve and I did. That's already up on the YouTube channel. Should be the video right before this one. So be sure to check that out. We talk top storylines, top position battles, top just names to watch here in the spring. There's a lot of change going on at Nebraska, a lot of different coaching staff changes, a lot of new personnel, transfer portal additions, high school additions. So there's plenty to talk about here in the spring. There's plenty going on the recruiting side of things as well. It's been a quiet few weeks. Nebraska has kind of, played things quietly while they've been, I guess, out of spring ball. A couple of the programs started spring ball earlier, have had big visit weekends. Nebraska just, as a result of not having spring ball started, has kind of taken most of Feb and most of March pretty slowly on the recruiting trail. They had one visit in March leading up to the start of spring ball. That was Colin Campbell, a rising three-star 2026 offensive lineman they're watching. Campbell is was in the midst of a Midwest tour and stopped through Lincoln. There's at least some interest there. I have a little more over at InsideNebraska.com if you want to read a little more about that visit. But starting this week, there's going to be visits practically every single day. Every practice, Nebraska's going to have somebody in town. And so we've got a couple names confirmed. We're going to run through some of those names here over the next week on guys expected to visit over the next few days. Starting on March 25th, Nebraska is going to have 2027 four-star tight end Jack Brown on campus. Brown visited for 2 games last fall, and he's the number one player in the class of 2027 out of the state of Missouri, a top tight end. Nebraska's battling, of course, in-state Missouri, Illinois, a few other regional programs at this point in the mix for Brown, but he's got some big national offers. Texas A&M, a couple SEC, other SEC schools are in the mix as well. This feels like Missouri's got the early edge. Just they've done a really good job trying to keep him home, making him feel like a priority early on. But I don't think it can be ignored the fact that Nebraska's had him on campus, getting him on campus now for the third time. I expected to get him on campus again either this summer or into the fall again. So I think Nebraska's a real player here. I think they're a top contender. But again, 2027, plenty of time to go. But good to see Brown getting back to campus and good to see Nebraska staying proactive with the 2027 cycle. The next day, March 26th, Ryan Murray, Nebraska, a rising in-state or a rising interior offensive lineman for Nebraska. He's planning to make his first trip to campus. Nebraska offered him in January. He's a three-star center out of Miami Southridge. Nebraska's battling Miami, Ole Miss, Georgia Tech, a few others in that recruitment. Murray just recently won the heavyweight state championship in wrestling in the state of Florida. He's the number one ranked heavyweight wrestler in the state of Florida. And you watch his film, that's a maul. He's a mauler. He's like a Big Ten style center. He can play center or guard. I kind of see him as a center at this point. And you look at Nebraska's board along the interior of the line. He's the guy that makes some sense as the center target in this cycle. So Nebraska's going to have a really good opportunity to make an impression, try and earn, a return official visit here in the summer. Hometown Miami is, of course, the favorite at this point. Miami's made him feel like a priority. The opportunity to stay closer to home is something that really stands out to him. His father is the superintendent, I believe, at his high school, so or the principal at his high school. So I think the opportunity to stay close to home is something he's really intrigued by. But he's exploring national options. Nebraska's made a pretty big impression since offering, and so they're about to get him on campus and have an opportunity, like I said, to impress. So that's a big one. I think that's one of the bigger visits of the week, and that's going to be a guy that to keep an eye on down the stretch of this 2026 cycle because he's a top priority along the interior of the line. Also on that day, Cooper Hackett, 2027 four-star offensive tackle out of Oklahoma is visiting. That's another somewhat recent offer by Nebraska. They were one of the first programs involved. He's 6'7", 250 pounds, has some obviously some room to grow into that frame, but two-sport athlete, you really like the functional athleticism you see on the basketball court, and you like what he's done on the football courts or on the football field so far, playing both sides of the line. Ultimately, long-term does project to offensive tackle. Like I said, Nebraska's in early, but Oklahoma was in this mix. Texas Tech, a few others, and I think his recruitment and his stock's only going to continue to rise. So, but go to Nebraska, getting him in town early. This is going to be one to keep, kind of keep filed away for the 2027 cycle. I think he's a name. We talk so much about this 26 class, and a lot of these impressions with the top targets were made this time last year, and they're coming back around. So the fact that Nebraska's getting him on campus this early, and he's going to get an opportunity to kind of take in practice, visit with the coaching staff, and do all those things. That's pretty important. Um, Moving on to the weekend, starting March 27th, Nebraska going to have Trey Taylor, their number one 2027 quarterback target, in town for a visit. Taylor's, of course, the number four quarterback in the country per Rivals, top 15 prospect as well, regardless of position, and truly an elite quarterback in the 2027 cycle, one of the more highly coveted quarterbacks in the country. He's aiming to make a summer decision. So these spring visits are important. Even though he's a 2027, it's critical. Nebraska has him on campus, and they're working not just to get him on campus now, but potentially again in the spring, just to make as much of an impression as they can before that expected summer decision. Nebraska's battling Notre Dame. That's the program closer to home, really standing out. Michigan's in that mix. Illinois is in the mix. Illinois has done a really good job as of late. Texas A&M's in the mix, LSU's in the mix. I think my read, and I've mentioned this a few times at this point, my read at this point is I don't think he's close to a decision. I don't think he's has a certain school or schools in mind. But I think as we're looking at this, I think the draw of the SEC is going to be tough to overcome. I think LSU, Texas A&M, Alabama recently offered, Auburn recently offered. I think those four programs have just a leg up just from being in the SEC. I think specifically LSU and Texas A&M for how long they've been recruiting him. And if you were to tier those two programs too, I think LSU is the one. A&M's at next school right now, but closer to home, I think ultimately, if he does stay in the Big Ten or stay closer to home, I think Nebraska's well positioned. I think they've done a really good job. They had him on campus for the win over Rutgers, which wasn't the most impressive win. Didn't really show the offense, to its full capacity, to its full strength. And I do remember talking to him after that game, and he mentioned, the atmosphere and meeting with the coaching staff really stuck out. But it was the second visit. He came back later that season for the win over Wisconsin. Got to meet with Dana Holgerson, got to see the offense, put up a couple more points and actually, kind of show some stuff offensively. And so he's intrigued by, potentially playing in Dana Holgerson's offense, the development that comes by being in Glenn Thomas's room. And he's a big fan of Dylan Raiola. He likes the way Dylan plays. He wants to kind of emulate, not necessarily emulate his playing style, but wants to have that similar level of success. Aims to carry himself in a similar way as well. And so he's the guy that's doing his research, being very thorough about this process. His parents are involved as well. Of course, for an elite quarterback, NIL is going to be involved. Those conversations will happen. I expect this spring with all these different schools. And when you're battling the SEC, specifically LSU, Texas A&M, NIL is a factor, and NIL is going to be something that Nebraska's going to have their ducks in a row and ensure, that they have a competitive offer out for Taylor. That being said, later that weekend, March 29th, Nebraska is going to get Keegan Croucher, 2027 four-star quarterback on campus. Croucher has not been offered by Nebraska just yet. He's a four-star quarterback out of the Northeast, specifically the New England area. Nebraska, of course, Matt Rule, EJ Bartel, a few guys on staff have some strong relationships up in that New England area. And so that's kept Nebraska, that has his attention. He's been pretty drawn to Nebraska since dialogue has been started with the coaching staff. And so he's a guy to keep an eye on. I don't know necessarily what's going to come of this visit. I think how Taylor's visit goes affects whether or not Croucher gets an offer while on campus or how Nebraska approaches that visit. But they're not necessarily putting all their ducks um, or all their eggs in the Trey Taylor basket. They are diversifying their 2027 QB board. We talked about that a little bit last week. So Croucher, Taylor, two of the bigger visitors this upcoming weekend. Taylor will be the one first game he'll get in on Friday, or maybe even Thursday night. Croucher gets in closer to Sunday. So those two are two of the more important visits, I think, for this next week. Over at Inside Nebraska, in this week's Timbits, we kind of talked about some top 26 targets lining up some visits. A big one that we got confirmed this week was Jax Tanner, the rising three-star interior offensive lineman out of Meridian, Rocky Mountain High School in Idaho. Nebraska's after two Idaho offensive linemen here in this 26 cycle, four-star Kelvin Obot and three-star Jax Tanner. And I know people see three-star they shot. But this is one of the faster rising prospects in the country. Tanner won Idaho Gatorade Player of the Year. Has landed offers from Oregon, Michigan. Oregon and Michigan both love them. They want him real bad. USC's in that mix. Boise State, in-state, of course, is in the mix. BYU, a few other programs, but Nebraska's had his attention for some time. Donovan Raiola went out to see him. Keith Williams went out back in the fall, and Keith Williams was making the rounds to go see him. And so that just gives you an example of how an important target Tanner is. He's another one that can play guard, can play center. I project him kind of to guard at this point, but he's a guy that can for sure play center. And I think at this point, I think he's Nebraska's top interior line target. Now we're doing the big board series over at InsideNebraska.com. Be sure to check that out. He's the top dog on the interior of the offensive line for Donovan Raiola. And so this is a big visit. It's going to be his first time on campus. Nebraska's working to get him back in town for a return official visit this summer. So this opportunity they'll have this upcoming weekend is going to be an opportunity to not only impress and create some separation and earn some staying power, but also an opportunity to get him back on campus and schedule that official visit. So I'd expect some news on that coming out of the weekend. I imagine while he's in town, the staff's going to work to get that official visit scheduled with him if he so chooses. Of course, it's up to him to decide whether he wants to come back for an official visit or not. But at this point, I have no reason to think Nebraska won't get an official visit out of him. Nebraska is also going to get 2027 four-star offensive lineman Kennedy Brown out of Kingwood, Texas, in town this weekend for a visit. Kennedy Brown's one of the top offensive tackles in the 2027 class. Really good athlete, really impressive, multi-sport athleticism, like on both sides of the ball as well. You really like the sophomore tape from him, and he's a guy that's still steadily developing. Nebraska offered in January while making the rounds in Houston. They really like him. And this is going to be an opportunity, like some of these other 27s we've mentioned, just to get, that make that early impression and earn another visit, earn, consecutive visits, get him back in camp on campus in the fall for a game day visit, get him back again now this time next year for spring practice, and eventually the hope is to get him back on an official visit next summer. 2027, of course, with plenty of time with that one, but that's another big one. And perhaps the biggest weekend of the whole, or the biggest visit of the next week, is Titan Davis, arguably Nebraska's top 2026 target, regardless of position. Davis is an elite four-star defensive lineman out of St. Louis, specifically just met Jesuit in St. Louis. He's drawn some comparisons to Chase Young from his play style and his size, just the comparisons. It's kind of easy to make. You look at him and you kind of see the way he plays. Makes some sense, and Chase Young's a very high ceiling, but he's that type of guy, that type of player. You go back and watch his junior film. He was a one man wrecking ball on the defensive line, a guy that kind of made life hell for opposing offenses, and it's hard to find any offensive lineman in the state of Missouri that can block him. Of course, Jackson Cantwell. I'd like to see that matchup at some point. Jackson Cantwell, number one player in the country versus Titan Davis. They're not. I don't think they're ever going to meet in on the field, but that would be a competition that I, for one, would like to see. But Davis last visited Nebraska around this time last year, actually closer to the spring game last year. Spent 4 or 5 days on campus. He was on campus for multiple days. I remember we saw him at a Thursday media availability, watching practice and kind of roaming around, and then he stuck through the spring game that following Saturday. So this is actually Nebraska's first time getting him on campus since then. Um, they really like it. Obviously, they really like it. He's the most important, arguably the most important target on the board. And you look at the D line board right now as it goes through some shuffling with Terry Braden taking over, him getting a feel for how recruiting works and all of that. The D line board has shrunk a good bit. They've lost some targets off the board. Some guys who just kind of decided to, take their interest in Terrence Knighton and follow him to Florida State. So guys like not Malcolm Sims. Malcolm Sims is obviously committed, but guys in this next class, Jamarian Carlton, Taj Overton, were guys we've talked about, 26 defensive linemen that were high on Nebraska at one point. Now they're high on Florida State because Terrence Knighton's down there. So there's going to be some shuffling to the D-line board, but Davis remains a top priority target for Nebraska. And as of right now, I like where Nebraska stands. Of course, in-state Mizzou's a program to watch. Oregon's in the mix, Alabama, Georgia. The who's who of college football are all involved in this recruitment. He's got a busy spring ahead. He's planning to get out to some schools nationally he hasn't seen before. And so right now, I do like where Nebraska stands. They've done a really good job making him feel like a priority. He's enjoyed every trip he's made to campus so far. Nebraska has sent six coaches, including Matt Rule and defensive coordinator John Butler, out to Desmet in January just to let him know how big of a priority he is. And so that tells you a lot about where they kind of see him, what they think about him as a prospect. And so, but we'll have to see. I think this spring is going to be really important for him. He's going to get out to places like Texas, go to places like Georgia, and some of these schools for the first time. And those type of visits. We'll see what happens. Right now I feel good about where Nebraska stands. I think they're going to be able to get him back for an official visit in the summer. And I think they're in the upper echelon of contenders. He recently announced a top 14, which I know is kind of silly, but when you consider the guy's got, 25 plus offers, it's a cut down is necessary of some type. And so he's still figuring things out, but I like where Nebraska stands. Ultimately, it just depends on how this week goes, whether they can get him back for an official visit. And, they have to impress on the field at the end of the day. I think that's something that he's waiting to see. I think this weekend he'll get an opportunity to meet Coach Braden for the first time. They've had some conversations to date, just over the phone, but haven't been able to meet. So this is going to be his first time meeting him, getting familiar with what John Butler wants to do defensively, how it differs from Tony White. So this is going to be, yeah, it's an important weekend for Davis, for Nebraska, and again, I don't think he's going to make any type of early decision. I think the earliest you can expect a decision from him is the summer after he makes these official visits. But he's also the type of prospect, just getting a feel for this recruitment that I think he can push it into the fall and push it potentially up to signing day because he's going to take his time with this. And I think schools, including Nebraska, are going to save that spot for him if he wants it. So that's about it. That's going to be like the top guys in town here this in the next week or so. We'll have a big update next week on how the visits went, and then that April 4th weekend is a pretty big weekend for Nebraska. So we'll have all of that next week. Appreciate you guys tuning in. I guess before we get out of here, I did want to touch on just a few other just hodgepodge of 2026 notes. Does Evan Walker, Nebraska's top 2026 running back target, originally told me he wasn't planning on making any unofficial visits this spring, was going to wait to do everything till the summer, going to do all these official visits, and then make a decision. He's updated those plans. He's planning to make a visit to Notre Dame this spring and a visit to Nebraska at some point this spring. Doesn't have a date locked in for any of those just yet, but he wants to see those two schools again. I imagine he's going to go out to Kansas, which is a short trip for him, out of Raymore Peculiar in Missouri. So I think he's going to see those three programs unofficially. And I think those are the three programs really involved at this point. Oregon's hanging around a little bit. Missouri's in that mix. There's a few other programs kind of hanging around, but I think it's Notre Dame, Nebraska, and Kansas. And I wouldn't sleep on the Jayhawks right now. They're doing a really good job making priority targets feel like priorities. They've really ramped up NIL efforts. Notre Dame as well really likes him, and obviously coming off the state champ or the national championship appearance, have some momentum on the recruiting trail. But EJ Bartel's done a really good job here. He's been on campus multiple times, feels comfortable on campus. There's some familiarity with his former teammate Jaden Doss on the roster right now, and so there's reason to feel good about where Nebraska stands, and getting him back on campus this spring is a big deal, and that's another opportunity for Nebraska to create some separation and potentially enter the summer official visit stretch as the leader in his recruitment. Another note I wanted to pass along. We talked about it in Timbits this week. Be sure to check that out. Every week, it's our most informative recruiting piece that we do. Some intel in there that you're not going to see here, just because we got to protect that with the paywall. You know how it is. But one name I wanted to pass along. Calvin Thomas is one of the fastest rising prospects in the 2026 class, maybe the fastest rising prospect. On January 1st of this year, he had zero offers. As we speak right now, he's got 29, and he could clear 30 by this summer. He's got Texas A&M, he's got Oregon, he's got every program you could possibly want in the mix for him. Nebraska offered in late January, and he's talking to his family, setting up official visits. I think he's a kid that's still figuring out this process, of course, because this has all happened so fast for him. Again, January 1st, zero offers. By the end of January, I think he had crossed double digits, and by the end of Feb, had hit 20 plus, and now he's close to 30 offers. Like that's just it's unreal. It's been an unreal rise for him. It's been a lot of new attention, a lot of new things for him to figure out. And so he's actually in the process of figuring out which schools are going to get official visits from him. But he tells me Nebraska is going to be one of those schools that gets an official visit. He's a true edge rusher. I think when you look at him in Nebraska's scheme, he's a true jack in how Nebraska kind of plays now in the 3-3-5 and what they're looking for. He's got to put on a ton of weight to ever play on the actually on the line, but he's a perfect jack candidate. Supernatural pass rusher. Good bend, good size. You like the combination of traits there. Is the reason he's got 29 offers currently. So that's just one last note I wanted to pass along. That's just going to be someone to keep an eye on the next few weeks as we kind of check in with him and make sure that visit date gets locked in, or if that visit date gets locked in. But that'll probably do it for us. Appreciate you guys tuning in. We'll be back next week with reactions to this week's visit and a preview of next week's visit. As spring ball kicks off, we've got so much content over at InsideNebraska.com. We'll be boots on the ground for press conferences all week. And Thursday is going to be our first opportunity to see some of the new additions to the roster in action for the first time. First time seeing Dana Holgerson and Dylan Raiola after a full offseason together. So there's going to be plenty to talk about after that open practice viewing on Thursday. So stay tuned for all the content we'll have over at Inside Nebraska, and we'll be back with another episode next week.